one of the big differences between learning at university and the way that you approach things at university to the way that you have in the past is that you've got to take a critical approach. And we don't mean by that the everyday use of the word criticise, and that sometimes confuses people. So if you're criticising a friend, if you're criticising their outfit, you're probably not being very nice about it. But if you are criticising a research paper, it might be that you are actually saying positive things. So really all you're doing is you're questioning. So by criticise, we just mean question. So it might be that you say that a research design is really appropriate and that the findings are really could be applied to practice. So everything that you approach, you just start to ask questions of, so what do they mean? Why are they saying it? What's the evidence for what they're saying? Is it convincing? Is there any kind of bias or assumptions that I need to think about? And a really good way to start thinking about it is, if you have a think about the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Does everyone remember that from childhood? So who's the hero of it? Jack. The obvious answer is Jack, and that's the kind of everyday understanding of it. But if you take a critical approach, if you step back a bit and think, why is Jack the hero? He disobeyed his mother by taking beans rather than money for the cow. He threw them away in a fit of anger. Beanstalk grew, so he went off, trespassed in the giant's land and stole his goose. Not much of a hero. Whereas the giant, all he was trying to do was get his goose back. So arguably, if you look at the evidence, it's actually the giant that's the hero and not Jack. So there's a real difference between the kind of everyday understanding, received wisdom of things, and the critical truth if you actually start thinking things through. And the good thing is, though, that we've got all of these critical skills, and all you need to do is move them from your everyday life to academic life. So you don't believe every advert that you read. You know, you don't think your hair's going to shine like Cheryl Cole's just because she says so and you're worth it. You don't reply to every email saying give your bank account details so the guy can just rest that money in your account for a bit, because you ask critical questions of it. You've made really big decisions in your life. You've maybe bought a house or a car. You all decided to come to this university and do this course. And again, you asked critical questions before you came. So you weighed up why here as opposed to UWS, why your branch as opposed to another one. You looked at the different sources of information, you weighed up what was right, you listened to the talks and perhaps were a little bit suspect about some of them because you knew they were selling things to you, and then you made a decision on what was best. So that was critical thinking. And if you ask those questions of research papers and so on, then you'll begin to take the right approach. But a lot of people fail to be critical, and that's where you don't get marks as well as you should. You know, you find sometimes in feedback that people are saying you're just descriptive, you need to be more critical. And I've got some examples here of common mistakes people make. So one might be that you accept a treatment works or an idea works because it was effective in a few instances. So for example, maybe 5 athletes take a food supplement and their performances are improved, so you say therefore this supplement works. 5 athletes is not a big enough sample size. There's not enough evidence there to make any conclusions. But you see that kind of thinking in adverts quite a lot. You know, if you look at 9 out of 10 people preferred, it was actually only 10 people they asked. So is that big enough sample? Another common error can be accepting someone else's opinion because they know better than you. And that happens a lot in academic work. You know, you get lecturers or people who wrote that particular model, and they tell you something, and in the past you've just had to kind of accept that. Well, you shouldn't anymore. You should say, well, what's their evidence? If a lecturer says this model's the best one to use, they should be able to tell you why, and then you should be able to make your own mind up. Another error can be where you side with one point of view and you don't really consider other possibilities. So the example I've got down here is that you decide a client's behaviour problem is because of bad parenting, when actually it could be a sign of an underlying medical condition perhaps. So you need to consider lots of different perspectives before you actually make any kind of decision. And the decision that you make has to be logical and based on all of the evidence. And another issue can be where you decide something's true when actually the evidence is limited. So you can start your research with an idea already in mind. You think you know what the answer is, and you only look at the evidence that points to that, and you ignore everything that disputes it. The critical thinker would maybe start with some ideas, but they'll only make the conclusions when they've actually read all the evidence, and anything that disputes it, they'll also include in their writing, but they'll just say why they were less convinced of it than other things. So once you've taken this critical approach, you need to demonstrate it to the people marking your essays, and you've got to do that by writing critically. And I've got an example of the way that you would maybe approach that, and why writing at second year and third year looks different to the essays you've done in first year. So here is an introduction to an essay about medical models of health. So you might start off saying, the model states that, blah, 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 and you put in evidence and you give a good description of what the medical model was. And possibly for first year that might be enough because you've gathered evidence, you've used academic language and so on. To be critical though, for levels 2 and 3, you've got to then say, well, what about the model? So you start to think, well, what are its strengths? What are its limitations? Then you look for, are there alternative models? Are there other ways of approaching the way that you define health? So you look at social models and so on. And then you'd weigh up, well, which is better for which particular circumstance? How can you apply it to practice and so on?
So at this point, you should really be having a very critical approach to selecting the materials and then evaluating those materials as well. So ideally, at this stage, you should be reading everything critically. Certainly in second and third years, you'll be looking to move more towards journal articles and much more up-to-date things than textbooks, making everything that you do branch-specific and very tailored to the expertise that you're developing. So we've just got a couple of examples here of again, ways that people might kind of come short of being critical. This is an example of an organisation called the World Bank Group. Now, we all know that the World Bank Group is a huge non-governmental organisation that provides a lot of financial interventions, but it's not this particular one. Phonetically, the World Bank Group is exactly the same, but if you look closely and quite critically at this website, it's a parody, it's a kind of a pastiche of the World Bank Group's website. If we actually look at the World Bank's website itself, it's not a million miles away, as you can see. You know, visually it's very similar in the kind of the corporate colours it's used, but as you start to look at the content, maybe even the last updated page, you could see, well, actually this is potentially somebody in their bedroom coming up with this as a joke. If you check the URL of the actual site, the World Bank Group is worldbank.org, you know, a much more kind of, it would certainly make you guess that it's something that's a lot more trustworthy. And then even the content itself is much more like something that would be affiliated with such a large organisation. And there's also this example here from the Daily Mirror website, which actually is quite interesting because it's potentially dual purpose. Thinking about what it's actually saying there, handwriting can help detect a bad heart. Well, considering how significant heart disease is within the UK, and thinking about any kind of potentially tenuous links with handwriting, just kind of think, well, you know, would I believe that at first read? So if we then go on to look at the content, a handwriting expert, okay, says the way that people use a pen shows up heart defects. So this graphologist, Christina Strang, suggests that people with heart problems rest their pen whilst writing, leaving a tiny mark on the paper twice as often as others do. Okay, bear with it. Christina compared the handwriting of 61 heart patients at Poole Hospital, Dorset, with healthy people. Now, by the time I get to the end of that article, I'm beginning to think, well, do I necessarily believe that? Again, given the prevalence of heart disease in the UK, is 61 as a sample really reasonable enough for me to make any sort of sweeping judgments? Is there any explicit medical link between how somebody writes and the health of their heart, and general well-being? And also, who is Christina Strang? In what way is she qualified to make these statements? We don't know anything about what a graphologist is, what type of qualification. It's possibly arts-based rather than science-based. Is there any sort of way that those two things could be linked? So, you know, we would maybe approach that with a certain level of scepticism. However, if you were writing an essay about media portrayal of heart disease in the UK, this might actually be very useful for you, because it's got quite a kind of a sensationalist, attention-grabbing headline. Handwriting can help detect a bad heart. Well, there may be people who don't have the medical expertise of yourselves who would think, oh gosh, you know, I'll need to watch out for people's handwriting because it might help me, you know, be able to be part of an intervention that could help save their life. So that might actually be a very useful resource to include, because it helps to show what popular recognition of newsworthy articles might be. So this idea of reading critically, you can approach in a number of ways. Ideally, you should be thinking about summarising and outlining complex material, and that's fairly central to all critical skills. What you're doing is synthesising resources from various different aspects of the reading that you've done and bringing them together to build an argument, and you would put that information together in all the writing that you do. So as part of doing that, you're evaluating the evidence that Steph mentioned. So is what's within a text accurate? Is it authoritative? Is it convincing? Are you convinced by what the author is saying because they've given you a very good argument themselves? You also get to gauge a text's importance or significance, so thinking about where it fits into a particular assignment that you're working on, a particular area of the clinical expertise that you're developing, so thinking if it actually is relevant and significant. You'll also be doing quite a lot of comparing and contrasting different texts, so in the same way that you'll be using comparison and contrasting your writing to bring all the different evidence together, you'll be doing the same thing when you're selecting resources too. So bringing them all together through synthesis. Also applying concepts or principles in one text to another, so thinking about how texts might be different but where the similarities might be as well. There might be a research experiment that's been carried out in one area of the UK using one particular methodology or looking at one client group that could be equally as well applied to another area of the UK that hasn't used a similar methodology. And you'll also be being quite critical of the way that a text achieves its effects. You know, is somebody writing very straightforwardly? Are they using a lot of jargon to shroud the fact that maybe there isn't a huge amount of evidence within what they're presenting to you? And you would also critically examine a text's reasoning as well. So thinking about how the argument has been built and what evidence is being there in order to convince you that the research is valuable.